Welcome to Hockey with Talks podcast. Today I'll be talking about some of the biggest NHL rivalries of all time. This is the second part of a podcast series I'm doing on NHL rivalries. In this podcast, I'll be talking about more of the NHL's biggest rivalries of all time. Montreal Canadiens versus Toronto Maple Leafs. The Canadiens and Maple Leafs are the league's oldest teams, with the teams being formed in 1909 and 1917 respectively. The rivalry between the two teams picked up after the Montreal Maroons folded in 1938, resulting in the Canadiens and Maple Leafs being the only Canadian-based teams in the NHL until 1970. Both teams saw success during the original Six era, with the Stanley Cup having been primarily awarded to either the Canadiens or Maple Leafs during that period. In addition, the rivalry was heightened by social issues in the mid-20th century in Canada, with the two teams serving as stand-in of variety of cultural differences in Canadian society. Most notably, with the Canadiens representing French-speaking Canada and the Maple Leafs representing the English-speaking part of the country. The rivalry between the two teams picked up in 1946, when assistant manager Frank J. Selke left the Maple Leafs to become the GM of the Canadiens, due to ongoing tension between himself and Conn Smythe, the owner of the Maple Leafs. Toronto and Montreal faced each other in 11 postseason series between 1944 and 1967. During the 1940s and the 1960s, the two teams reigned exclusively as Stanley Cup champions during the decade, except in 1961, which was won by the Chicago Blackhawks. The Canadiens and Maple Leafs have met in 16 Stanley Cup playoff series, including 5 Stanley Cup finals. Unfortunately, the rivalry between the two teams isn't the same as it once was in the original Six era, due to the fact that the two teams played in separate conferences of the NHL from 1981 to 1998. In addition, the two teams did not meet in the playoffs from 1980 to 2020. Although the rivalry is no longer what it once was, it remains a symbolic relationship. It remains symbolic of the relationship between the country's two largest cities, Toronto and Montreal. And now, a word from our sponsor. Check out my scouting blog at hockeywith777scouting.com. Listen to my scouting blog podcast on podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/hockeywith777scouting. Pittsburgh Penguins versus Washington Capitals. The Pittsburgh Penguins and Washington Capitals are one of the biggest rivalries in the NHL right now, but this rivalry goes all the way back to the start of the 1990s. Pittsburgh and Washington finished first and third in the Patrick Division respectively, and met in the Patrick Division Finals in 1991. Pittsburgh went on to defeat Washington en route to winning the 1991 Stanley Cup. In the 1991-92 season, the Capitals finished second in the division and in the entire league, while the Penguins finished third. This set up a second consecutive playoff meeting between the two teams. This time around, the Capitals would take a 3-1 lead in the series. Pittsburgh rallied to win the next 3 games to win the series, en route to their second straight Stanley Cup, bringing home the 1992 Stanley Cup. The 1992-93 season would see both teams capture the top 2 spots in the Patrick Division. Pittsburgh won the division with a franchise record 119 points in the regular season, including an NHL record 17-game winning streak. However, the third place team in the division, the New York Islanders, would upset both Washington and Pittsburgh in the playoffs, thus preventing a third consecutive Capitals-Penguins playoff matchup. Pittsburgh and Washington has been one of the most heated rivalries in the 2000s, as both teams play in the Metropolitan Division of the Eastern Conference, since 2013. The rivalry stems from 11 playoff series between the two teams, which is the second most between NHL expansion teams, between only the Dallas Stars and St. Louis Blues, who have met 14 times in the playoffs. Pittsburgh has won every series except the 1994 Eastern Conference quarterfinals and the 2018 Eastern Conference second round semifinals, in which Pittsburgh was actually heavily favored in both times. There is also only a 250-mile drive between Washington, D.C. and Pittsburgh, allowing fans of both teams to attend each other's games in fairly large quantities. In addition to the geography and deep playoff history, the emergence of Alexander Ovechkin and Sidney Crosby as two of the NHL's biggest superstars fueled both the teams and their individual rivalries. The rivalry reached new heights in the late 2010s as the teams won 3 consecutive Stanley Cups between them from 2016 to 2018, with the Penguins winning in 2016 and 2017, where the Penguins defeated the President's Trophy winning Capitals en route to winning the championship, while the 2018 Capitals eliminated the 2-time defending champions in the second round en route to winning their first Stanley Cup. In fact, all 6 championships combined between Washington and Pittsburgh have required defeating each other in the playoffs. Although this is a relatively new rivalry, the hatred between the two teams is real, and due to the amount of times they have played each other in the playoffs, it is very intense. As long as Crosby and Ovechkin are still playing for their respective teams, every matchup between Pittsburgh and Washington is must watch. Check out my hockey blog at hockeywiztalkshockey.blogspot.com. Follow me on Facebook and Instagram at hockeywiz777. Detroit Red Wings versus Chicago Blackhawks. The Detroit Red Wings and Chicago Blackhawks had one of the most fierce and intense rivalries in NHL history. Fans had much animosity for each other, with Blackhawks fans chanting "Detroit sucks" in each and every game. Prior to the 2013-14 league-wide divisional realignment, Detroit-Chicago was arguably the most intense rivalry in the Central Division. It was a historic rivalry. The two teams represented the 2 largest metro areas in the Midwest, and are only separated by a 280-mile stretch of road, mostly covered by I-94. The clubs began playing each other in the 1926-27 season during the inaugural season for both franchises. These two clubs have faced each other in more regular season games than any two teams in NHL history. Only the Bruins-Canadiens rivalry exceeds them in total games played, when Stanley Cup playoff games are included. During the 26-year period where the NHL had only the original 6, both teams were controlled by the Norris family. James Norris owned both franchises until his death in 1952 and split the rival teams between both his sons. His older son James was co-owner of the Blackhawks along with Arthur Wirtz, while his brother Bruce inherited ownership of the Red Wings. In 1961, the Blackhawks, led by Bobby Hull and Stan Mikita, broke a 23-year drought without a title, defeating Gordie Howe's Red Wings. The rivalry cooled a bit in the 70s, when the Blackhawks were moved to the West Division and the Red Wings were moved to the East at the beginning of the 1970-71 season. At the beginning of the 1981-82 season, they were once again reunited in the Norris Division, which was eventually renamed the Central Division in 1993. Blackhawks Red Wings games were notorious for its fighting. Bob Probert and Stu Grimson played for both teams and fought each other frequently. Chicago native Chris Chelios was booed upon his return to United Center as a Detroit player in 1999. And former Red Wing Marian Hossa earned the same response in 2009 at Joe Louis Arena as a Blackhawk. Including the 2013 Stanley Cup playoffs, the two teams faced each other in the playoffs 16 times and have played over 800 games against each other. Due to the realignment before the 2013-14 NHL season, the two teams only meet each other twice a season, as they are in different conferences. It's just unfortunate and a shame that one of the best and most historic rivalries in NHL history is on pause at the moment. Listen to Hockey Wiz Talks podcast on Podbean and Spotify. Check out my travel channel at youtube.com/HockeyWizTravels. There are a few more rivalries I want to talk about in my next podcast.